The SS Edmund Fitzgerald left Superior, Wisconsin around 2:15 p.m. on November 9, 1975, captained by Ernest McSorley with a load of approximately 26,000 tons of taconite ore, bound for Zug Island, Michigan, just outside of Detroit. That morning, the National Weather Service predicted that a storm would pass just south of Lake Superior, bringing some gale force conditions to the lake, but nothing the Edmund Fitzgerald couldn't handle. Around 5 p.m. on November 9th, the Edmund Fitzgerald was joined by a second ship, the Arthur M. Anderson, and the two ships decided to travel together across Lake Superior. At around 7 p.m. on November 9th, the National Weather Service altered their forecast, stating that the storm would go directly over the eastern portion of Lake Superior. Hearing this and knowing that it would bring gale force conditions to the entirety of Lake Superior, both the Fitz and the Anderson decided to alter their course more northward to put them in the lee of Isle Royal and give them some shelter from the wind. At around 1 a.m., both ships ran into the winter storm, and at around 3 a.m., the National Weather Service upgraded it from a gale force warning to a storm warning, indicating wind speeds of somewhere around 60 miles per hour, with waves that could be upwards of 15 to 20 feet. Throughout the day on November 10th, both ships would continue to fight rough seas and high winds, with the winds initially starting out of the northeast, but as the center of the storm passed over them, they shifted from the south and then from the northwest. By 2:45 p.m. on November 10th, 1975, snow had picked up significantly, and the Anderson lost complete sight of the Edmund Fitzgerald, as the Edmund Fitzgerald was significantly faster than the Anderson. At around 3:30 p.m. on November 10th, the Fitz radioed the Anderson to report they had lost two vent covers, a fence railing, and were beginning to list, indicating that water was entering the cargo hold on one side. Just 40 minutes later, the Edmund Fitzgerald radioed to the Anderson again to report that it had lost both radar systems and was now effectively blind, and asked the Anderson to catch up to them so that the Anderson could guide the Edmund Fitzgerald to safety using its radar. At around 4:40 p.m., McSorley called the U.S. Coast Guard to find out the status of the Whitefish Point Lighthouse and radio beacon. They told him that their monitoring equipment said that neither one were working. They needed both of those because they were headed towards Whitefish Bay for safety, so they called ships that were in the area of Whitefish Point to ask what the status was. The Avifers, captained by a man by the name of Cedric Woodard, answered and stated the light was working, but the radio beacon was not due to power loss from the storm. At one point, Woodard asked McSorley how he was doing, and he replied, "I have a bad list. I've lost both radars, and I'm taking heavy seas over the deck in one of the worst seas I've ever been in." At about that time, wind speeds would have been sustained at about 67 miles per hour from the northwest, with waves at approximately 25 foot high every 1 to 3 seconds, and peak waves of about 35 feet. At 7:10 p.m. on November 10th, 1975, the Anderson called the Fitzgerald to inform them of a ship passing on their left side. They also asked how the Fitz was doing. Captain Ernest McSorley replied, "We are holding our own." That would be the last time anyone would ever hear from anyone aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald. A few minutes later, the snow would clear and the Anderson would realize they couldn't see the Fitzgerald. The captain, believing the Fitzgerald had lost power, told his crew to keep an eye out for a silhouette on the horizon because they could see three lights, but those were three different ships that were not the Fitzgerald and were about 17 to 18 miles away. The Anderson would attempt to call the Fitzgerald several more times, but would receive no response. The captain, Bernie Cooper, then tried to call the Coast Guard at Sault Ste. Marie, but was told to switch to a different channel, but then never received a call back. At around 8 p.m., the Anderson called the Coast Guard again and told them he was pretty sure the Edmund Fitzgerald was gone. This time, the Coast Guard tried to call the Fitzgerald, but received no response. At 8:30, Captain Cooper called the Coast Guard yet again and informed them he was very concerned about the whereabouts of the Fitzgerald because it was not showing up on any of the radars of the ships that Captain Cooper had called to check to find the Edmund Fitzgerald. At around 9:30 on November 10th, the Coast Guard sent out one of their ships to begin searching for the missing Edmund Fitzgerald. It wasn't long after it issued that it was unable to continue and had to turn around and return to the Sault Ste. Marie Coast Guard station. At the same time, another ship was dispatched from Duluth, Minnesota, but that was 300 miles away and would take the majority of the day to get there. Without options, they called the crew of the Arthur M. Anderson and requested they turn around and go back out into Lake Superior to search for the missing ship. In addition, they asked several other ships in the area to turn around and go back out to search for the Edmund Fitzgerald. 2 said they would. Only 1 would eventually make it out of Whitefish Bay, the William Clay Ford. But of course, the only thing they would find would be some debris and some damaged floating lifeboats. The Edmund Fitzgerald sank with all hands so quickly a distress signal was never sent. All 29 men aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald would die as the ship sank in 530 feet of water. None of their bodies have ever been recovered. Now, there are several theories as to what sank the Edmund Fitzgerald, but none of them have ever been conclusively determined. The ship is at the bottom of Lake Superior in 2 separate pieces, separated by approximately 200 feet. The bow portion of the ship is sitting upright. The stern portion of the ship is corkscrewed in one direction, sitting upside down. The first theory is that simply the ship was swamped by continuous waves. Freeboard of the ship in the area where the actual cargo was only 11 feet, meaning that from the waterline to the top of the ship was only 11 feet. The waves at the time were approximately 20 to a maximum of 36 feet in height, which is more than enough to continue swamping the Edmund Fitzgerald with water, which would be indicated by the heavy list that he was experiencing. The second most popular theory is the Three Sisters theory. Basically, there are 3 rogue waves that happen back to back to back on Lake Superior, which are approximately 1/3 higher than a normal wave. So at that time, the Anderson reported there was a 30 to 35 foot wave that hit her and then headed in the direction of the Fitzgerald. And then there was a second 35 foot wave that hit her and then headed in the direction of the Fitzgerald. And there was a third one that hit the Anderson and then headed in the path of the Edmund Fitzgerald. If the Fitzgerald was already suffering from flooding problems with water washing over the deck, having a first and then a second and then a third 35-foot wave wash over the decks likely added so much water it couldn't retract and the ship sank. The third theory is the cargo hold flooding theory. Essentially, there was so much water piling up on the deck of the Edmund Fitzgerald that the hatch covers for the cargo hold were weighted down so much that they failed and fell inward, which allowed more and more water to flood into the hold. Now, the evidence for this is that several of the cargo hatches had failed from the outside and fell into the hold itself. They were attached via clamps, so there was a portion like this, the hatch went over it and then clamped down on the side. These portions right here, called the coamings, were bowled inward and broken off into the cargo hold, as well as several of the hatch covers. The other theory is that the Fitzgerald struck a shoal that wasn't known to be there. Near Caribou Island, just northwest of where they eventually sank, there is a shoal called 6 Fathom Shoal. At the time, it extended about a mile further than was on any navigational charts. If the Fitzgerald struck that shoal and bowed up in the middle, basically the bow and the stern went like this, it would indicate why he had a broken fence railing that he reported to the Anderson. This shoaling would have ripped a hole in the bottom of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which would have led to the sinking. The problem is, there's no evidence that the shoal was ever struck. There's no evidence on the Edmund Fitzgerald that it hit anything, so this is unlikely to be the cause. And then there's the theory that the Edmund Fitzgerald hit the bottom of Lake Superior and broke apart that way. You see, the area where she sank was only approximately 530 feet deep. The length of the Edmund Fitzgerald was 739 feet. So, if they came over the top of a particularly large wave and broke down into a very deep trough and plowed themselves in the bottom of Lake Superior, it would help indicate why the ship was broken in half. In addition, there is a large amount of taconite ore that has poured out all over the wreck site, indicating that the stern was at least floating as the bow came apart and dumped ore down onto the ship itself. In the aftermath of the disaster, the Mariners' Church in Detroit rang its bell 29 times for each man aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald. There have been a number of memorials in honor of the Edmund Fitzgerald, including Gordon Lightfoot's song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. In 1995, the ship's bell was recovered and replaced with a replica with all 29 men's names carved into it. In addition, the dive team placed a single beer can in the pilot house of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Edmund Fitzgerald is the last freighter to sink on the Great Lakes with the loss of all hands. So let's talk about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Specifically, let's talk about the storm conditions. The crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald and another crew, the Arthur M. Anderson, found themselves in the evening of November 9th, 1975, into the afternoon to evening hours of November 10th, 1975. So, on November 9th, 1975, at around 2:15 p.m., the Edmund Fitzgerald, which was a Great Lakes freighter, 739 foot, with a load of approximately 26,000 tons of taconite ore, which is low-quality iron ore, left Superior, Wisconsin at the far end of Lake Superior, bound for Zug Island near Detroit. Their plan was to head out, go the normal downbound route, and then out through the Sioux Locks to Lake Huron and then down to Zug Island. Additionally, about 2 or so hours after the Edmund Fitzgerald left Superior, another ship, the Arthur M. Anderson, left Two Harbors, Minnesota, bound for Gary, Indiana. They were also planning on taking the same downbound route along the southern portion of Lake Superior, down through the Sioux Locks, and then going into Lake Michigan down to Gary. When they met around here, they decided to travel together. The problem was, that morning, the National Weather Service had issued a gale warning for the eastern portion of Lake Superior because a storm system that was currently sitting down in northeastern Kansas was projected to move northeast and travel just south of Lake Superior. Because it was just south of Lake Superior, it was expected that winds on Lake Superior, in the eastern portion of Lake Superior, would be out of the north. They would start out of the east and then be out of the northeast, then the north, and then the northwest, as they traveled across, as the low moved through. So low's down here. As it moves this direction, these winds are going to shift around it because, again, winds blow in a counterclockwise direction around a low. So the two ships met up in this general vicinity around 6 p.m. and decided to travel together. The problem was, at 7 p.m., the National Weather Service realized that instead of the low going just south of Lake Superior, it was actually traveling more northward and was going to go directly across the lake just west of Mississippicotten Island, which is right here. What that means is that instead of only having gale force winds expected for the eastern portion of the lake, they had to issue gale force wind warnings for the entirety of Lake Superior, which is somewhere around 40 miles per hour. That meant that the two ships over here didn't want to travel along the southern portion of Lake Superior because if they are on this west side of the low, that means winds are going to be blowing out of the northwest, the north, and somewhat the west, depending on where the low ends up being. If they're down here, the wind has all of this space to build up waves and beat their ships as they're trying to travel along. So the two captains decided together that they were going to shift their course northward and try and get into the lee of Isle Royale, which would give their ships some shelter from the winds and the waves. Now, as they reached the lee of Isle Royale up here, this is Isle Royale right here, at around 1 a.m., several captains heard over the radio the captain of the Edmund Fitzgerald, a guy by the name of Ernest McSorley, say that he had to slow down due to the rough conditions, which shocked a lot of the captains on the Great Lakes. He had been around for a long time, and he was well known to never slow down for anything. So the fact that he was experiencing rough enough seas that he had to slow down was already a major problem. Now, the two ships continued on this direction, which eventually the Edmund Fitzgerald overtook the Arthur M. Anderson, and the Fitzgerald was faster than the Anderson, and they continued to travel across Lake Superior. Now, as the low moved across the actual lake itself, as they moved into this area right here before they started a southward journey, the winds slowed down and then shifted directions. Now, as they turned towards the south, the wind started to blow out of the northwest, this direction. Now, this wind shift here, where it dropped significantly, would have been about 1:50 p.m. on November 10th. So they're somewhere in this general area just northwest of Mississippicotten Island, and wind speeds dropped to out of the northwest at about 5 to 10 miles per hour, and then about an hour later, about 2:45, they cranked up to about 40 miles per hour, and then they cranked up even more after that to about 55 miles per hour by about 3:30 p.m. Now, at this point, as they're both traveling south towards what is Caribou Island right here, moving just west of Michipicoten Island. At around 2:45 p.m., it began to snow pretty heavily. And at this point, the Edmund Fitzgerald was about 16 miles in front of the Arthur M. Anderson, and it began to snow so much that the Anderson lost complete sight of the Fitzgerald. It was around 3:30 that the Fitzgerald radioed back to the Arthur M. Anderson as they're moving down just west and south of Caribou Island that he was beginning to experience a list. He had lost his radar, and he had 2 hatches that were broken as well as a railing. He did not explain how the hatches had become broken or the railing had become broken. He honestly may not have known how they became broken. At that point, that's when he decided to slow down so the Arthur M. Anderson could use their radar to help guide the Fitzgerald down to their ultimate goal at this point, Whitefish Bay, just past Whitefish Point, because at that point you have winds that are blowing about 60 miles per hour sustained at that point, and because of the way the wind is blowing, it is going directly this direction. So the wind has this entire lake called the Fetch all the way across to build up speed and to build up those waves. The Anderson reported that when they were north of Caribou Island, waves were about 15 to 18 feet high. When they were south of Caribou Island, they became 18 to 25 feet high. Now, at around 5 p.m., as the Fitz and the Anderson are heading south, they are attempting to get into Whitefish Bay, into the lee portion, because that will at least give them a break from the winds and the waves. There is a lighthouse at the end of Whitefish Point right here that is there to guide mariners into Whitefish Bay. It has a lighthouse and a radio beacon. At around 5 to 5:30 p.m., the captain of the Fitz, Ernest McSorley, radioed the Coast Guard and said, "Hey, is the lighthouse working? Is the radio beacon working?" The Coast Guard replied that their monitoring system said neither one was working. So McSorley radioed to any ships that were down here in the Whitefish Point area and said, "Hey, is the lighthouse working? Is the radio beacon working?" One of the ships, the Aberfirst, radioed back and said, "The beacon isn't working, but the light is." And then proceeded to ask the Fitzgerald how they were doing. And that's when McSorley said that he was developing a list, his radar was down, and he's experiencing the worst seas he's ever been in, which for a captain like Ernest McSorley would have been incredibly bad seas. It's estimated that winds or waves were approximately 25 feet, with several rogue waves that were upwards of 35 feet. Now, as the Fitz and the Anderson continued south, the Anderson picked up on their radar 3 ships that were going upbound to the east of the Fitzgerald. So they radioed the Fitzgerald, said, "Hey, there's 3 ships coming up. You make sure you don't hit them because they don't have radar." They asked if they were going to miss them. The Anderson said yes. Then the Anderson asked the Fitz how they were doing. At around 7:15 p.m., McSorley replied, "We're holding our own." And that would be the last time anyone would hear from anyone aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald. About 5 minutes after that conversation, the Anderson checked their radar for the Fitzgerald, but she was nowhere to be found. Around that same time, the snow finally cleared up, and they could see lights of ships that were 19 miles away and the light from the lighthouse, which was 20 miles away, but could not see the lights of the Fitzgerald anywhere. The Andersons, the captain, initially believed they may have lost power and tried to radio the Edmund Fitzgerald, but received no response, but told his crew to be on the lookout for a silhouette. The problem was, the Fitzgerald had sunk with all hands. All 29 men aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald would die. At about 7:40, the Anderson's captain called the U.S. Coast Guard at Sault Ste. Marie, who basically told him, "Call back on a different channel because we're having issues." He called back on that channel, got no response. So the captain of the Anderson, a man named Bernie Cooper, contacted other ships in the area that were traveling upbound to see if they could find the Fitzgerald on their radar. They also could not do so. So at around 8:30 p.m., the captain of the Anderson again called the Coast Guard and said, "Hey, I think the Fitzgerald is missing. I can't find him." And so they attempted to reach out to the Fitzgerald and got no response. Finally, at around 9 p.m., Captain Cooper called the U.S. Coast Guard again and was like, "Hey, it is officially missing. We cannot find them." At that point, they sent out their own ship from the U.S. Coast Guard in Sault Ste. Marie, which was a very tiny boat that couldn't make it. So at around 9:30 p.m., after the Anderson made it to Whitefish Bay down here, the Coast Guard officially asked them to return and search for the remains of the Fitzgerald. The only thing they would be fined would be some debris and some damaged lifeboats, as well as a couple life jackets that had floated free of the ship. The Edmund Fitzgerald had sank in approximately 530 feet of water without even the time to issue a distress call. So let's talk about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, specifically the potential reasons as to why the Edmund Fitzgerald sank. Now, if you don't know what the Edmund Fitzgerald was, it was a Great Lakes steel-hulled freighter that carried primarily iron ore up and down the Great Lakes in the 1950s to 1975. It sank on November 10th, 1975, with the loss of all 29 men aboard the ship. Now, it was 739 feet in length, which at the time of when it was launched made it the longest ship on the Great Lakes, which gave it the title of Queen of the Lakes. It was then beat a couple of years later by another ship that was 740 feet long. But the Edmund Fitzgerald had the typical layout of a Great Lakes freighter at the time. This is the bow of the ship here. This is the stern back here. On these ships, you had the engine room and the crew mess and all of that back in the stern portion of the ship. And in the front, you had the pilot house right here where the captain was and where all of the steering and all that went. Basically, you power here, steering here. In the middle, you had a cargo hold. The Edmund Fitzgerald technically had 3 cargo holds. It was hold 1, hold 2, hold 3, counted from the bow towards the stern. Technically, it was one big cargo hold. It was divided by non-watertight mesh dividers in between. On top of these, you had 21 hatches that were 11 feet by 48 feet that were covered with steel hatch covers that they would put the ore into the ship itself. Now, to cut away the side of the ship, if you look at the inside of the ship, it's not just cargo all the way down. You have tanks on either side and the bottom around the cargo. Those are called ballast tanks. Basically, when the ship is empty, they will fill those with water so it sits a little bit lower in the water so it's a little bit more stable. In addition, on either side of the cargo, above the ballast tanks, they have tunnels. Basically, if someone was in the engine room or the bow and needed to go either direction in the middle of incredibly rough seas, they could travel through these tunnels instead of going up on the deck and risking being, blown or washed overboard. So that's what those tunnels are for. In addition, I need to explain exactly how the hatch covers worked for the Edmund Fitzgerald because it's incredibly important. So, on your deck, you have it like this, right? You have walkways on either side so that crew can walk up and down on the deck. You have your cargo here in the middle. Your iron ore gets dumped down inside and starts to pile up down in here. Now, once you're full, you take your hatch cover, and it's basically just a giant piece of sheet metal that goes over the top. But you have to have something to clamp it to. So what they did was they extended it up just a little bit on either side, called a coaming. Basically, so the cover can go over top of it like this, and they have something to actually physically latch it to, right? Because if it's just flat down, they don't really have anything to latch it to. So they give it a little bit extra up from the top so they can put the cover down on top of it, latch it down by hand, and then it sits. The problem is these are not watertight. I need you to know that this is not a watertight seal. In addition, the holds themselves, all 3 holds, are not watertight either. Now, the other thing we need to note about the construction of the Edmund Fitzgerald is something right here that's stuck up on either side of the weather deck along the very exterior of the ship. Now, when ships are built, the holes themselves are built in basically strips of steel. So you have a chunk of steel that's welded to another chunk of steel, and each layer as you move up, kind of like a brick wall, is called a strake. And the very top layer at the very top of the ship is called the shear strake. It's the very last one. It's usually one of the thickest and strongest of the entire ship. Now, the Edmund Fitzgerald had a shear strake that stuck up on either side of the weather deck 15 3/8 inches. Now, this is going to be important later, so remember that. And then one other thing that needs to be noted is that during the life of the Edmund Fitzgerald, when she was first built, she was originally only supposed to carry about 22,000 tons. But later on, they decided to raise the cargo level of the Edmund Fitzgerald to allow her to carry 26,000 tons. What this did was decrease the freeboard of the ship by about 3 feet. The freeboard is the amount of the ship that sticks up above the water. It went from about 14.5 feet to about 11.5 feet. So On the day it sank, there would be about 11.5 feet of the actual Edmund Fitzgerald sticking up out of the water at its lowest point, which would have been right here in the middle with the holds. So our first two theories are more or less the same, that they were swamped by waves. One is that it was just the normal 25-foot waves of the storm, and the other is that the Edmund Fitzgerald was hit by the three sisters. Now, in order to understand exactly what happened here, you have to understand how waves are measured. So you have your normal wave like such. You've got your crest here, you've got your trough here. Your actual 25-foot measurement is going to be from the bottom to the top. This is going to be your 25-foot measurement. So as the Fitz is traveling south, the waves are going to be coming this direction, coming more or less from the back over towards the front. And because the Fitz was only sitting about 11.5 feet above the water line, it's going to be continuously swamped all the way through by these waves, because at least half of it is going to be about 12.5 feet, which means that as it comes over, it's going to wash at least some of that water up on the deck. So basically the theory is that these waves kept washing over the Fitzgerald from the back and the side, and it started to build up water. And because these hatch covers aren't watertight, water started to build in the actual hold itself amongst all of the load of iron ore. Because they couldn't see it, because they had no way of knowing if there was water in the hold or not, McSorley had no idea. In addition, because of the shear strake, water would wash up on the deck, and then approximately 14 or 15 inches of it would be stuck on either side because it's stopped by that wall. That's going to add a significant amount of water weight to the actual ship itself. And the more water that gets in the hold, the more water that sits up on the deck, the lower and lower and lower it gets, and less freeboard it has, until eventually it's gone. The Three Sisters theory is basically the same, except instead of it being a normal 25-foot wave, it's a 35-foot wave. You get hit by one, which puts a bunch of water on the deck, and then you get hit by a second 35-foot wave, which puts even more water on the deck, and then you get hit by a third 35-foot wave, and that just sends the ship to the bottom of the lake. Now, these theories are supported by the hatch covers were found, several of them in the front were found inside the actual hold themselves, indicating there was a significant amount of damage and weight that dropped those in and pulled the actual coamings off and the hatch covers down into the hold itself. Now, the next theory is the shoaling theory. Basically, it is believed that the Edmund Fitzgerald may have struck essentially an underwater mountain. Near Caribou Island, just north of where Edmund Fitzgerald sank, there is a shoal known as 6 Fathom Shoal. At the time, it was unknown that it extended about a mile eastward from where it had been charted, and it was believed that the Edmund Fitzgerald struck the shoal and ripped out a bottom portion of its hull. In this, it is believed this because McSorley stated that he lost a railing. Now, the reason that they believe that it struck a shoal is that when a ship strikes something underwater like that, it'll scrape along the bottom, and then as the bow and the stern are sitting on either side of the shoal, so it's like this, they will force themselves this direction, right? Which will apply stress in either direction on these railings along the top, which can cause one of these to snap. The problem with this theory is there's no evidence on the ship itself that it struck anything, and they also did underwater analysis of the shoals, and there was no evidence that a ship had struck it. Now, the other theory is the cargo hold flooding theory, basically that the crew didn't attach all of the clamps for the hatch covers. Some of them came loose, the hold became flooded, the ship sank. When it hit the bottom, it broke in two because the actual ship itself is sitting at the bottom with this, the bow portion is sitting upright like this. The stern portion is sitting upside down like so. And they're saying that it broke in half when it hit the bottom like this. The problem with this theory is there's evidence on the bottom of the lake that the stern had stayed on top of the water and dumped a bunch of the taconite ore down, and then it capsized on the surface and then landed on top of some of the cargo at the bottom of the lake. So it wouldn't make sense for it to come down and settle at basically the same time. And then there's another theory that the Edmund Fitzgerald essentially split in two on the surface. Whenever it would go over a large wave and it would come back down, it would spring back into place like someone had just jumped off a diving board. And Basically, there were enough waves that it caused a stress fracture in the middle of the ship, which split it in two, which explains why half of it is in one location and half of it is in another. In my opinion, it seems most likely it's a combination of the waves and a stress fracture in the hull. About specifically one of the potential causes for the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald is basically that there was a stress fracture in the middle of the ship, right down the middle of one of the holds, that caused it to break in half on the surface and then sink that way. And basically would have been either the action of the waves, the rogue waves, or water getting into the hold and causing the water to shift through it all the way to one end and breaking the ship in half that way. Now, as a little bit of background, the Edmund Fitzgerald did in fact have a sister ship. It was called the Arthur B. Homer. The only difference between the Edmund Fitzgerald, which was the older ship, and the Arthur B. Homer, which was the younger ship, is the Arthur B. Homer was 730 feet instead of 729 feet. Because, of course, younger siblings always have to try and outdo the older sibling. Anyway, at the time the Edmund Fitzgerald sank, the Arthur B. Homer was laid up in dry dock, being extended from 730 feet to 829 feet. After the Edmund Fitzgerald sank, the Arthur B. Homer was put back into service to continue carrying ore. As the NTSB was doing its investigation into the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the National Transportation Safety Board, they were looking into several reports from former crew members of the Fitz, basically saying that if you walked along the tunnels that went along the top of the ship right here, you could see cracks in the welds. So when ships are being built, basically they are being built in chunks of steel, right? And it kind of looks like this. It's like, here, we'll do it this way. It's like a brick wall. You have like this, and then you go up a level, and it's like this all the way across, like so. And these joints, for most of the older freighters, were riveted. So they would drill holes and they would put rivets in all the way around. The advantage of those rivets, which you really can't see, but the advantage of those rivets is it allows, as the ship is going over the waves, it allows the hull to flex and bend with the waves so that it doesn't crack. The thing was, with the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Arthur B. Homer, these were not welded, these were not riveted, these were welded. Welds do not bend as well as rivets do. So, several people on the Fitz basically said that as they walk through in these are called strakes, the rows on the exterior of the ship, these are called strakes. As they walked along the tunnel, they could see cracks in the strakes all the way down. Now, the theory was that if they went and looked at the Arthur B. Homer, they could gauge whether or not they were having the same issue, because the Arthur B. Homer made basically the same runs as the Edmund Fitzgerald did, and if one is having it, the other one is probably going to have it because they were made the exact same way. So, in 1978, the NTSB requested to ride on the Arthur B. Homer. The owners of the Arthur B. Homer said absolutely not, for no reason. And then, 2 years later, just 5 years after they spent a whole bunch of money extending the ship to 829 feet, they permanently laid up the Arthur B. Homer, and then 7 years later, they scrapped her. It is still the largest ship that has ever been scrapped in Great Lakes history, with no explanation, no understanding as to why. They never let anyone look at the Arthur B. Homer to see if it had similar cracks. None of that. Now, do I think it was the stress fracture alone that sank the Edmund Fitzgerald? Honestly, no. I think it was a contributing factor, but I think there were several contributing factors to the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So if you think about this, if you have these welds in the middle of the ship that are already starting to crack, the ship has already been loaded more than it was originally designed for, because in 1969, 1971, and 1973, the U.S. Coast Guard allowed the Edmund Fitzgerald to raise its load line to the point where it only had 11.5 feet of freeboard. Basically, there was 11.5 feet of the ship sticking up above the water line, and basically it took them from having a designed carrying capacity of 22,000 tons to a designed carrying capacity of 26,000 tons, which we all know exactly why. So, if you think there's a stress fracture here, these cracks in this weld are starting to crack, right? And you're in the middle of an incredible sea. Now, the captain of the Edmund Fitzgerald, Ernest McSorley, stated numerous times over the radio during this entire event that he was in some of the worst seas he'd ever seen. He was known as a heavy seas captain. Basically, he didn't turn around. He didn't stop for anything. And he was regularly saying over the radio, I need to slow down. This is the worst sea I've ever seen. Things of that nature. Now, if you already have these stress fractures in here, and you take in any of the other factors that may have led to the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So one is that it hit a shoal, 6-fathom shoal near Caribou Island, and it scraped a lot on the bottom and allowed water to start to fill into the hold. You come over and you start going over these 25, 30-foot waves, which are coming up from behind, go over the top of a wave. You have all this water in here. Your ship falls down this direction. All of this water in the hold, because these sections are not waterproof. So all of the water suddenly fills this direction. Your bow goes down. Your stern is stuck in the air. You hit the bottom of the lake and it breaks off. Or you get lifted up in the air going over a wave. It snaps as it's coming back down off the front of the ship. The bow goes down. The stern is still up on the water, dumping taconite ore out, and then eventually falls to the bottom and lands about 250 or so feet away from the front of the ship. Or if we take what Ernest McSorley said over the radio, basically that they had lost a railing and they had lost vent covers and they had a heavy list and they had 2 of their 6 bilge pumps going full speed the whole time and were still listing, we can assume there was at least some water inside of the ship when it came over a wave or something of that nature, and it shifted all that water forward. It snapped this stress right here, snapped it and sent it to the bottom of the lake because it was already broken. It just needed that extra weight to cause it to finally collapse. But in addition to that, if you think about, you've got a list on one side, you've lost vent covers, you have 2 bilge pumps running, you have water at least in your tunnels and probably in your hold. The tunnels are the things that allow the crew to walk back and forth from the engine room to the bow, to the pilot house. If you have cracks in your hull and they are large enough, you're going to start getting water coming in through those cracks. If it's on one side more than the other, you're going to get a list to that side. So if you've got cracks in the middle here, water pouring in through those cracks, you're going to end up with a list. You're also probably going to lose a railing because waves are going to be crashing over that particular lower spot at a significantly higher rate, and you'll lose the railing on that side. So it seems like the most likely situation is that there were stress cracking in this, as evidenced by multiple people that had worked on the Edmund Fitzgerald seeing them. In addition, there were several other factors, large waves, water in the hold, a potential shoaling, all of those things that led to the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. But it all comes back to likely this stress fracture because of deferred maintenance. Because in 1975, once the shipping season was over, the Edmund Fitzgerald was going to be laid up and also extended like the Arthur B. Homer was. But obviously it sank before it could do that.